The cardboard box looked ordinary when it arrived at the New York Historical Archive. A little dust clung to its edges, the kind of dust that made Archivist Dr. Clara Whitman's throat itch when she leaned close. She had opened dozens of donations like this before. Wedding albums, faded invitations, brittle diaries, but this one carried the name Leonardo Moretti, a once-famed photographer whose studio had captured New York's wealthiest families between 1910 and 1960. Inside lay thousands of wedding photographs, each a frozen smile from the roaring 20s. Clara slid one print free, its silver gelatin surface still gleaming after a century. At first glance, it was everything you'd expect from 1921 high society, the marble steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral groomsmen in spotless morning coats, bridesmaids in soft pastels, and a handsome groom standing tall as though the city itself belonged to him. But the longer Clara stared, the colder the room seemed to grow. The bride, Margaret Ellison, daughter of a federal judge, was dressed in silk and pearls, her veil spilling like river mist down the stairs. From a distance, her lips curved in a polite smile. Yet, through Clara's magnifier, the smile collapsed into something else entirely. Her eyes did not shine with joy. They widened with terror, fixed not on her husband nor the camera, but somewhere beyond, toward an unseen threat. What had this young woman seen at the very moment her life was meant to begin? And why did the joy of an entire wedding party crumble in her gaze alone? The photograph seemed to breathe with the confidence of its age. Rows of men in tailored coats, their lapels catching the summer light, stood shoulder to shoulder like a wall of certainty. Bridesmaids in pale lavender silk leaned forward ever so slightly, their parasols tilted with perfect coordination, as though every angle of fabric and posture had been rehearsed for weeks. Behind them, the carved stone of St. Patrick's Cathedral stretched upward into the sky, its Gothic arches throwing long shadows over Fifth Avenue. To any casual viewer, it was a portrait of harmony, wealth, and stability. Yet Dr. Clara Whitman felt none of that. Sitting beneath the yellow glow of her desk lamp, she moved the magnifying glass once more across the bride's face. Margaret Ellison was meant to embody the optimism of the 1920s, the daughter of a respected federal judge, her gown embroidered with beads imported from France. The kind of detail only the richest families could afford. But Clara saw something that no amount of silk or lace could disguise. Margaret's lips, painted carefully by a handmaid earlier that morning, were pulled into the shape of a smile. But her skin told another story. Beneath the powder lay a sheen of sweat, a trembling tension, as though her very muscles resisted the performance. And then the eyes, those wide, unguarded eyes. They were not looking at her new husband, Edward Langford, the heir to a railway fortune. Nor were they meeting the lens of Leonardo Moretti's camera. They looked past it off to the side into the crowd. In that instant, Clara imagined what Margaret must have seen: a figure, a shadow, a presence that turned her blood cold even as the wedding bells still echoed. Clara had examined thousands of portraits, most of them mundane. Smiles often stiffened into awkwardness, sometimes revealing nerves, sometimes boredom. But this was different. It was not nerves, not fatigue. It was terror, raw and undisguised. Clara's stomach tightened, as if she were intruding on a private nightmare. She pulled the print closer, feeling the edges cut into her gloves. Why would a young bride at the height of her family's social triumph appear so horrified? In the archives of high society weddings, this disconnect was unprecedented. For a moment, Clara considered the possibility of a flaw in the emulsion, a trick of light, perhaps even deterioration of the print. But no, Moretti's photography was impeccable. The terror was not an accident of chemistry. It was real. Unable to shake the unease, Clara began to piece together the context. She retrieved the fragile envelopes that had arrived with the Moretti collection. notes, business ledgers, invoices written in looping fountain pen script. Her finger stopped at a line dated June 1921, Langford Ellison wedding St. Patrick's Cathedral. Full party platinum package. There was no mention of incident, no hint that the photographer had captured more than polite pageantry. Yet something else bothered her. In the society columns of the day, weddings like this were documented with relentless enthusiasm. Clara had already scanned a clipping from the New York Herald, which described Margaret as exquisitely radiant and Edward as the very model of a modern husband. The pages glowed with descriptions of champagne fountains, orchestras, and silk canopies. But then, at the very bottom of one column, Clara found a line that snagged her attention. The bride, though graceful, appeared somewhat pale and required gentle support from her attendants during the photographic sitting. Support, pale, gentle. Words chosen carefully meant to smooth over something rougher. Something people in 1921 society did not speak of openly. Clara's pulse quickened. It wasn't just her imagination. Others had noticed, too. She adjusted her chair, leaning closer to the photograph. In the reflection of her magnifier, Margaret's eyes seemed to stare back at her, pleading across a century of silence. It unsettled Clara in a way few archival discoveries ever had. She whispered into the empty room as though speaking to the ghost within the paper. "What happened to you?" The air in the archive felt heavy, the silence pressing down. Outside, the city traffic murmured faintly, but Clara heard only the imagined drumbeat of her own heart. This was not merely an artifact. It was evidence of fear, of danger, of something that had gone terribly wrong on a day everyone else remembered as triumphant. Unable to resist, she set aside the photograph and pulled open her laptop. A quick search of genealogical records confirmed what she already suspected. Edward Langford, railway heir, had married Margaret Ellison, daughter of Judge Henry Ellison, in June 1921. The match had been celebrated in the Times, the Herald, even smaller papers as far away as Boston. But buried in those glowing reports, Clara began to notice small cracks, faint but consistent. Mentions of Margaret's delicate health. Observations that she avoided the crowd for much of the reception. Even one whispered note about her sudden withdrawal from Bryn Mawr College the year before. Piece by piece, the joyful facade of the wedding began to crumble. Clara imagined the crowd on that June morning society. Ladies adjusting their hats, photographers, flashing bulbs, reporters scribbling notes. All eyes on the radiant couple. All except one pair of eyes, Margaret's, locked instead on a figure just beyond the camera's frame. The realization made Clara's throat dry. What if Margaret's terror had not been metaphorical at all? What if she had truly seen something, someone who should not have been there? She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. The photograph was no longer just a relic. It was a message. A warning carried across time, preserved on a glossy sheet of silver nitrate. And Clara knew she couldn't stop now. She would dig deeper into family letters, police reports, forgotten testimonies until the terror behind Margaret Ellison's eyes could be named. Because photographs, Clara reminded herself, do not lie. People do. The next morning, Clara returned to the archive earlier than usual. The city outside still yawned in shades of gray steam rising from manhole covers, the muffled clatter of a delivery cart echoing along the narrow streets. She unlocked the reading room, slipped on her white cotton gloves, and laid the wedding photograph flat on the desk once more. Overnight, her dreams had been filled with the bride's eyes, Margaret's wide, terrified gaze that refused to soften, no matter how she tried to imagine it differently. It felt less like studying a photograph and more like keeping vigil over a secret. Clara began where any historian with the society columns. She pulled the reels of microfilm from the shelves, their black cases labeled in fading white pencil New York Herald, June 1921, New York Times, June 1921, Tribune. The whir of the microfilm reader filled the silence as she scrolled through page after page of bold headlines, advertisements for silk gloves, notices of new Broadway productions. And then there it was, Langford Ellison Union, a celebration of social prominence. The article painted a portrait of perfection. Edward Langford, described as the golden son of American Railways, had married Margaret Ellison in a ceremony said to unite power and justice, railroad wealth with judicial honor. The words glistened on the page, polished to please readers hungry for glamour. Clara scribbled notes, guest list of 200 reception at the Waldorf Orchestra from Vienna. But buried deep within the ornate prose, she caught something easily overlooked. The bride appeared delicate pale at times, and was graciously assisted by her attendants during the photographic sitting. Delicate, pale, assisted. The pattern gnawed at Clara. It was language designed to conceal, to soften the edge of what might have been a scene of distress. If this were merely a case of nerves, why would the reporters linger on it? Why did it surface in more than one paper? She printed the articles, stacking them beside the photograph like pieces of a puzzle. Her next step was the Ellison family. As the daughter of Judge Henry Ellison, Margaret had been raised in a household where appearances mattered. Clara accessed the court's archival donations, a collection of the judge's personal papers, preserved in bound folders. Dust clung to the leather spines, the scent of age rising like smoke when she opened them. Among the typed rulings and official correspondence, she found letters written in the judge's own hand. One, dated March 1921, froze her in place. Addressed to his brother, it read, "Margaret's circumstances have become untenable. The Langford family shows remarkable patience and understanding, and young Edward has pledged his protection. For this, we are grateful beyond measure." The words felt heavy-coded. Protection, patience. Those were not words of romance. They were the words of crisis. Clara leaned closer, tracing the ink with her gloved finger. Margaret was not marrying into luxury by choice. She was being shielded. From what or from whom? Digging deeper. Clara uncovered a letter from Margaret's mother to her sister dated April 1921. "We pray daily that marriage may offer sanctuary. Edward is an honorable man who comprehends the gravity of her ordeal. He alone can provide her escape from torment." Clara's breath caught. Escape, ordeal, sanctuary. These were not metaphors for a nervous bride. They were the desperate words of a family who believed their daughter was in danger. The realization cast Margaret's expression in a new light. She had not been overwhelmed by the grandeur of the day. She had been cornered, forced to perform joy, while danger loomed only feet away. Clara's hands trembled as she replaced the letters. She thought again of the photograph, of the way Margaret's gaze was fixed not at the camera, but at something just beyond it. Was it a person, a figure among the spectators outside the cathedral? She turned back to the genealogical database. Margaret Ellison, born 1899. Bryn Mawr College, enrolled 1918, but records showed a withdrawal in late 1920, citing personal reasons. Clara tilted her head. Students did not abandon such prestigious studies without cause. She jotted the note, adding it to the growing timeline. And then, in the brittle pages of a local newsletter preserved in the archive, she found a small reference that deepened the mystery. Miss Ellison, recently returned from her studies, has spent much of the winter in seclusion at her family's townhouse. Though seldom seen in society, she is expected to re-emerge for her anticipated wedding to Mr. Edward Langford. Seclusion, withdrawal, protection. The language repeated itself like a drumbeat of fear. Clara rubbed her temples, the low hum of the archive's fluorescent lights gnawing at her nerves. She imagined Margaret confined within the tall windows of the Ellison townhouse, curtains drawn every knock at the door a source of dread. What force could have driven a powerful judge's family to such measures? What danger lurked that even marriage was seen as a shield? The deeper Clara went, the more the ordinary fabric of the 1921 wedding unraveled. This was no mere love story captured on Moretti's camera. It was a moment suspended between wealth and terror, performance and panic. Her eyes fell back on the photograph. Behind the smile, the pearls, the carefully curled hair, Margaret's gaze carried a truth that the newspapers could never print. And Clara knew she had only scraped the surface. Somewhere in the records of New York, police reports, court filings, perhaps even whispers in the margins of forgotten diaries lay the answer. She whispered again to the photograph, her voice barely audible in the stillness. "Who were you looking at Margaret, who was waiting for you on those cathedral steps?" The silence pressed back heavy and patient. But Clara had already resolved that she would not stop until the shadow in Margaret Ellison's eyes had a name. The name surfaced like a splinter breaking through skin. Clara had been tracing Margaret's timeline through fragments of letters and college records, and the pieces finally collided in a single chilling detail buried within Bryn Mawr's student archives. A disciplinary note dated November 1920 described the dismissal of a groundskeeper named Antonio Ricci. The entry was brief, clinical, but laced with unease, removed from position due to inappropriate behavior toward several students. Specific complaints regarding unwanted pursuit of Miss M. Ellison noted. Clara read the line 3 times, her pulse quickening. So there it was, the shadow behind Margaret's terrified eyes. The story began to take shape. Ricci was not a fellow student, not an equal in Margaret's rarefied world, but an employee, a man invisible in the grand scheme of college life until he wasn't. Clara imagined Margaret's morning routine on campus, walking under elm trees, books pressed to her chest, the air crisp with autumn. And somewhere in the distance, footsteps, always echoing a gaze pressing at her back. Ricci's fascination had started small comments about her beauty flowers left on her dormitory steps, but infatuation had quickly grown into fixation, and fixation into threat. Letters from Margaret's mother hinted at a daughter unraveling. She eats little, and sleep eludes her. The faintest noise startles her. We can no longer pretend she is safe here. They had pulled her from Bryn Mawr by Christmas, citing personal reasons. To outsiders, it looked like nerves, maybe poor health. To those who knew it, was survival. But Ricci hadn't disappeared. His dismissal only sharpened his obsession. Clara uncovered police notes from early 1921 in New York, reporting a man loitering near the Ellison townhouse. The descriptions matched Ricci's tall, narrow shoulders, eyes that lingered too long. He had followed Margaret home across states, carving himself into her life like a shadow that refused to recede. Clara's mind played the photograph again. Margaret's forced smile, her eyes darting past the lens. It made sense now. On the day of her wedding, she wasn't looking at the crowd or her father or the reporters. She was looking for him, and she saw him. The Ellisons, of course, had not been blind to the danger. Judge Ellison's correspondence revealed an anxious father who used every legal thread he could pull. He had secured injunctions, requested extra police patrols. By February, the family had even hired private guards for their Lake Forest estate, a drastic measure for a family that prized discretion. But legal paper and men with batons could not untangle Ricci's obsession. The letters repeated one word over and over: sanctuary. Marriage, they believed, would provide it. Edward Langford, wealthy and steady, could shield Margaret with resources her father's influence alone could not. Clara felt a cold knot tighten in her chest. It explained the rushed engagement announced barely 3 months before the wedding. It explained the mother's plea. "We pray daily that marriage will deliver her." The wedding had not been a celebration. It had been a fortress. And yet Ricci had been there, waiting, watching. The police notes hinted at sightings near the cathedral that morning. A passerby reported a man standing across the street staring at the procession. Another claimed he saw the man raise a hand to his throat, dragging his finger slowly across the skin. Margaret must have seen it too. The photograph captured the moment, the split second when the illusion of safety shattered. Clara shivered, though the room was warm. She imagined the sound of the organ inside St. Patrick's, the guests rising to see the bride, the scent of lilies filling the nave. Outside, amid the throng of curious onlookers, stood a man whose entire presence was a threat. And Margaret, bound by duty, wealth, and fear, had no choice but to step forward, to smile for the camera, to perform her happiness while terror gnawed at her spine. As Clara pushed back from the desk, her chair squealed on the linoleum floor, startling her. For the first time in her career, she felt as though the photograph was looking back at her, demanding not just analysis but recognition. This wasn't simply a story of social history. It was the anatomy of stalking, decades before the word had even entered legal vocabulary. Still, one question remained. What became of Ricci after that day? The police notes ended with sightings, warnings, but no arrest. And if he hadn't been stopped, Margaret's story might not have ended at the altar. Clara scribbled a list in her notebook, NYPD Case Files, 1921. Langford estate records, court transcripts. Every shred of paper might hold another piece of the truth. She was chasing a ghost, but not a harmless one. A ghost that had once breathed threats and terror into a young woman's life. She looked again at Margaret's face in the photograph. A century apart, the terror was still alive, preserved in silver halide crystals, and Clara knew she couldn't stop now. Somewhere in the next stack of brittle files was the moment when obsession turned violent. She whispered into the hush of the archive, "I'll find out what happened to him." The photograph, silent and unyielding, seemed to demand it. The answer came in the dim gray of another morning. Clara had secured access to NYPD's historical archives, a labyrinth of boxes stored in a municipal warehouse where dust and silence clung like cobwebs. She signed her name on the ledger, her pen scratching against paper yellowed by time, and followed a clerk down an aisle that smelled faintly of mold and ink. When the lid of the box labeled Incidents, 1921, Midtown Precinct creaked open, she felt the same tightening in her chest that she had felt staring into Margaret's eyes. Inside lay folders, brittle with age, the corners curled like dry leaves. She opened one at random, scanning the police shorthand petty theft disturbances accidents. But then she found it an entry dated June 12, 1921. The words leapt out. Subject Antonio Ricci observed at vicinity of St. Patrick's Cathedral during Langford Ellison wedding. Witnesses report threatening gestures directed toward bride. Clara exhaled sharply, her pulse hammering in her ears. The report was signed by Detective Samuel O'Rourke. It described the moment with chilling precision. Bride appeared distressed upon exiting Cathedral for photographs. Subject, Ricci, stood across Fifth Avenue, made eye contact with bride, drew finger across throat in slashing motion. Officers attempted pursuit. Subject fled into alleyways. Bride required assistance from attendants. The knot of dread in Clara's stomach tightened. Margaret hadn't simply imagined Ricci's presence, he had been there within sight, within reach. The very instant Moretti's camera captured her smile, her eyes had been fixed on the man who vowed she would never belong to another. Clara pictured the scene vividly. The air heavy with the echo of church bells. Carriages lined along the curb, their horses shifting restlessly. On the marble steps, Margaret's veil shimmered in the sunlight as her attendants arranged the long train. And there, amid the spectators craning their necks for a glimpse of society's elite, Ricci stood like a specter. He didn't shout. He didn't rush forward. He only let his gesture speak a line across the throat, a promise of violence. It was enough to paralyze her. The newspapers had smoothed it over with words like pale and delicate, but the police file recorded what really happened. Clara traced the ink, the strokes hurried, as though O'Rourke himself had felt the urgency of the moment. This wasn't the nervousness of a young bride. It was the raw, naked terror of being hunted. But the file didn't end there. It continued with a series of reports stretching into the summer and fall of 1921. Ricci hadn't disappeared. He lingered like a storm cloud. In July, a complaint was filed, Ricci spotted outside the Langford townhouse. August, threatening letters delivered filled with rambling declarations and explicit threats against Edward. September, windows shattered at the Langford residence, a dead bird left on the doorstep with a note pinned to its wing. "She will not be yours." Clara shuddered, imagining Margaret's nights filled with the sound of breaking glass, her mornings stained with dread at what might be waiting outside the door. The police reports recorded each incident with cold detachment, but together they formed a portrait of escalation. Ricci was no longer content to haunt the edges. He was pressing closer, testing boundaries, daring the Langfords to stop him. The final file in the folder carried the date December 15th, 1921. Clara felt her throat tighten before she even read the words. It was longer than the others, the handwriting urgent, the pages smudged as though written in haste. At approximately 8:30 p.m., suspect Antonio Ricci gained entry to Langford residence via second-floor window, lighting fixtures tampered with, family dining at time of entry, suspicious noises reported upstairs. Mr. Langford investigated encountered suspect in hallway near Mrs. Langford's bedroom. Violent struggle ensued. Suspect armed with knife. Clara's gloved hands trembled as she turned the page. Mrs. Langford appeared in hallway during altercation. Suspect turned on her maid verbal threats. "If I cannot have you, no one will." Mr. Langford, despite injuries, subdued suspect until officers arrived, alerted by neighbors hearing commotion. Both men sustained wounds. Mrs. Langford unharmed physically but in state of extreme distress. The report ended with Ricci's arrest and charges of attempted murder, burglary, and stalking. He had been sentenced to 20 years in Sing Sing prison. The detective's note at the bottom read, "Suspect demonstrates obsession beyond reason. Victims require continued protection." Clara leaned back, her breath shallow. The story had reached its violent crescendo not months after the wedding. What had begun as glances on a college campus had exploded into a home invasion that nearly claimed lives. The photograph, the one moment frozen in time, was not just a record of a wedding day. It was a harbinger of the terror that followed. But the photograph also revealed something else, something the police report could never capture. Margaret's courage. She had walked down the steps of St. Patrick's with her stalker watching. She had posed for the camera while her body quaked with dread. She had stood upright, smiled, even though her world was collapsing. That forced smile was not weakness. It was defiance. Clara returned to the image, her magnifier hovering over Margaret's eyes. For the first time, she understood the depth of that look. It was not just fear, it was the unbearable weight of pretending. Pretending for the cameras, for the guests, for society's relentless gaze. Pretending she was beginning a new life while knowing the nightmare hadn't ended. Clara whispered to herself, though the room was empty, she survived him. But did she ever escape him? The file said Ricci had been imprisoned, yet trauma doesn't vanish with a gavel strike. Clara imagined Margaret's nights after December 15th, the silence broken by phantom footsteps, the locks checked again and again, the taste of fear never leaving. A century later, it still burned in her eyes, and Clara realized something unsettling. Ricci had been captured, but Margaret's terror lived on, not only in her but now in Clara too. The photograph had passed the burden forward, demanding someone to remember to tell the truth. Clara closed the folder slowly, her gloves streaked faintly with dust. She had found the climax of Margaret's story, but not the ending. There were still pieces missing: the aftermath, the long shadow, the ordeal cast across her marriage, her life, her legacy. The photograph waiting patiently on her desk seemed to challenge her. Will you stop here, or will you follow the story into its aftermath? Clara knew her answer. Winter sunlight filtered through the high windows of the archive painting. Pale rectangles across the table, where Clara spread the final stack of papers. The air smelled faintly of cardboard and age, but to her it carried something heavier, like the residue of all the fear, grief, and silence folded into the documents before her. Margaret Ellison had survived Antonio Ricci, but the records revealed survival was not the same as freedom. Medical files donated by the Langford family painted a picture of a woman permanently altered. Notes from Dr. Edmund Ralston, dated January 1922, described persistent sleeplessness, nervous exhaustion, and heightened startle reflex. In modern terms, Clara recognized post-traumatic stress disorder. But in 1921, there was no such vocabulary. Margaret was labeled delicate fragile, afflicted by nerves. The words diminished her suffering, reducing a year of terror into polite euphemism. And yet, Clara saw signs of resilience. Letters between Edward and his younger brother revealed a marriage that had grown unexpectedly strong. Our union began as shelter, Edward wrote in 1922, but I have discovered in Margaret a well of courage that humbles me. Her laughter when it returns is a victory I would not trade for any empire. The phrasing was tender, uncharacteristic of men bred to wealth and duty. Edward had chosen love where circumstance had demanded protection. Clara imagined the Langford household after Ricci's arrest. The lamps burning late into the night, Margaret pacing halls that still echoed with the struggle of December 15th. The servants whispering about blood on the parquet floors. Edward insisting on relocating to a country estate in Westchester, away from the crowded city streets that had given Ricci shadows to hide in. To outsiders, it may have looked like a retreat, but for Margaret, it was survival. She did not retreat entirely, though. Newspaper archives from the mid-1920s showed her name resurfacing not in society columns, but in philanthropic circles. She lent her presence to fundraising events for women's shelters, particularly organizations aiding those fleeing violent men. One article described her quietly donating to a legal aid society, pressing for stricter penalties against harassment. She rarely spoke publicly, but when she did, her words carried weight. A woman should not be forced to prove her terror before she can claim her safety. For 1925, it was a radical statement. Clara leaned back in her chair, feeling the shift. Margaret had turned private agony into public advocacy. Though her life never returned to the glittering ease expected of a judge's daughter and a railway heir's wife, she forged a new path, one where her scars had purpose. Still, the scars remained. Family accounts recorded by her nieces decades later described her double-checking every lock at night, avoiding crowded theaters starting at sudden noises. She preferred small gatherings, gardens, over ballrooms. She smiled, one niece recalled, but her eyes always watched the door. Clara thought again of the photograph, that split second where terror overwhelmed performance, and realized Margaret had carried that moment with her always. The historical record could have ended there as a study of one woman's ordeal. But Clara felt it was more. When she pieced together her findings into a case study, she presented it at a conference of archivists and criminologists. The room had fallen silent as she projected the wedding portrait onto the screen. First, the audience gasped at its beauty, the grandeur of the cathedral, the shining gowns. Then Clara magnified the bride's face. Murmurs rippled as people saw what she had seen, the smile, the eyes, the terror. This photograph, she told them, is not just a relic. It is evidence. It documents the lived experience of stalking before the crime had a name. It preserves a moment of fear in an era when women were expected to suffer in silence. And it reminds us that even in the most polished corners of history, human anguish lingers waiting to be seen. The study was later included in an exhibition at the New York Historical Society, Hidden Truths, Fear and Survival in Early 20th Century America. The Langford family descendants of Edward and Margaret attended the opening. They stood quietly before the glass case displaying the photograph, their reflections merging with their ancestors' faces. One granddaughter whispered, "I never knew it was this bad. We were told only that she was nervous on her wedding day." Clara watched them carefully, sensing both sorrow and relief. By unveiling the truth, she had given Margaret's silent suffering a voice. A century late, but not too late. Yet the story lingered in Clara's mind long after the exhibition closed for the night. She often thought of Margaret's final decades, how she balanced fear with resilience, how she turned personal tragedy into public aid. And she thought, too, of the way photographs functioned not only as art, but as testimony. What other smiles concealed terror? What other portraits carried hidden cries for help, visible only to those who dared to look closer? The unanswered questions left the story open. Perhaps Margaret found peace in Edward's steadfastness, perhaps in her charitable work. Perhaps her nights were always haunted. History could not say. What it could say was this: the forced smile of a young bride had become more than a personal tragedy. It was now a testament, a reminder that danger can hide in plain sight, that survival takes many forms, and that courage sometimes looks like simply standing still, smiling, and enduring. Clara turned off her desk lamp and packed away the files. The room sank into darkness except for the faint glow of the city outside neon bending across the windows. She paused, hand resting on the folder that contained Margaret's photograph. The eyes staring back at her no longer seemed desperate, but resolute. Not weakness, but extraordinary bravery. She whispered one last time into the stillness, "We see you now." The silence accepted the words, and the story of Margaret Ellison, once hidden in a wedding portrait, lived on.